Hi, I'm Mike.
And I'm Larry.
Welcome to MANOPOD,
A podcast dedicated to men over 50.
brought to you by MANOPOD.com. Hi, I'm Mike, and this is Larry. And this fine gentleman is David Meeks, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and also the former managing editor of USA Today Sports. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me. Good to meet you guys.
Hey, David.
Good to see you.
Okay, so David, thanks for coming. You wanted to ask him a question. You were
we first heard about you with Hurricane Katrina when you wrote this amazing story of survival, how the city was trying to survive. Can you tell us about that?
You know, it was an unbelievable experience. Obviously, hard to believe. It's been 15 years since that happened. I'll be going back to New Orleans at the end of this summer for an event on the 15-year anniversary. But looking back at it at the time, a lot of people don't remember that the hurricane came through and had spared New Orleans. It was really the flood that we had to deal with. And I drove around the city after the hurricane and before the flood, and we thought we kind of had a near miss. And I never made it back to the newspaper. By the time I came back, I saw water coming down the street at a pretty good rate.
Wow.
And I took my Ford Explorer on top of a overpass and abandoned it. I did not get it back for a month.
Wow, you lost your house.
Had 7 feet of water in the living room, 10 feet deep in the streets. And, but we didn't know the levees had broken. One of the things I learned about Katrina is you can only rely on the information you have at the time. And you can plan for everything, and then you got to know when to throw the plan out. None of the models showed water around us because those levees aren't anticipated to break. So we were thinking we were going to go out and report the next day. We get up the next morning, and there's water rising up the front steps of the newspaper.
Wow.
And we're all ordered out. And, I've always been a pretty good passive resistor. Me and a few buddies, we were determined we were going to report this story because there's always that, journalists have that sort of run toward danger mentality. So we hid in the library.
We can't be journalists.
Yeah.
No, we're not journalists.
We hid in the library of the newspaper as they ordered the evacuation and tried to stay in, but they found us and they forced us onto a truck. So I had to go to plan B, which was I got to get one of these trucks.
That's great.
And that's what I did. So we commandeered a newspaper truck. I talked the editor into giving me the keys to it. I remember there was a guy from the executive office who didn't want to do it because he was afraid we'd destroy the truck. We did destroy the truck. It took about 2 weeks, but I talked the editor into it. We put together an all-volunteer team. He would not require anyone to do it. And it turned out to be a lot of people that I had hired because I had worked in various jobs at the newsroom. I was trying to become the editor of the paper. So I'd been a news editor at a couple places, and I was a sports editor. I ended up with a group of people who I knew pretty well. But it was like the Saints beat writer, the music critic, the art critic, completely eclectic team. And we loaded up in the back of that truck and we went behind the lines. And it was honestly 3 days before we saw any government help.
Wow. And what about your family? What happened with them?
They were gone to Jasper, Alabama, where I have family. And I'll never forget, my little girl told me, she said she was up there watching CNN and they had announced that the Times-Picayune had evacuated the city. And that they were out, and then CNN came back on and said, well, it turns out there's a small group of journalists who's from the New Orleans newspaper who are still in New Orleans. And she turned to her mother and she said, I guarantee you that was one of them. and I was. Yeah.
Now, you still had your animals at home, though, right?
Yeah, I didn't. We weren't allowed to bring pets to the newspaper. In the old days, you could bring your dog to the Times-Picayune because you ride out hurricanes. It's a hurricane-proof building, the windows and everything, but it's not a flood-proof building because water's rising. They ended that practice when someone locked a bunch of dogs in a room where all the newspapers were, and it turned out the dogs were relieving themselves on the papers they were saving for the journalism contest. So next time we weren't allowed to bring them, but I wasn't supposed to get flooded at our house. So I left them in the house. The dog was my father's dog. My father had passed away and I inherited him. The dog had never lived in a 2-story house. So I spent the whole last night at home on a leash pulling him up and down the stairs just in case and saying, talking to him, if the water comes, you got to go upstairs. He had never been upstairs. He'd only lived in a 1-story house. And as the flood occurred and I knew my house was flooded, I'm just wondering, well,
is he drowning?
Did he go upstairs?
Yeah.
Or what happened? And because he always looked out the front door, and if you looked at the way my house is oriented, it would have been the direction the water was coming from. Because the dog always laid there waiting for me to come home. So he saw that water coming. And, ultimately, as you know in that story, I made a harrowing attempt to rescue him and successfully did it. But it was a crazy journey.
Well, and you had help with that, right? In other words, you went in to get the dog. and there other people
Well, I
came
made
by.
a terrible decision, honestly. I mean, I said, can you guys get me to my house? And they tried to drive me out there. I have a kayak because in New Orleans, photographers use kayaks because they're shallow draft vessels. There's a lot of street flooding. You can get some pretty good images. So we had a company kayak. I had the kayak, and I said, can you get me out to my house? We pull over this overpass on I-10, and the drop-off point, it turns into an ocean, and we're 3 miles from my house.
Wow.
So I want to go home, and the truck gets me as close as they can, but it turns out that's 3 miles away. And so I kayaked 3 miles to my house, going against the floodwaters and running into things. Like I'd hit something because you couldn't see anything. The water was so black, and I would look down, and it would be like the top of someone's shed.
Oh, God.
So, and I'm going all the way there. And then the other thing, it is a moment where you're wondering, did I screw up? Have I made the fatal mistake? Because at one point I got hit by some brush that came just floating along, caught me up in it, and turned me sideways. And I thought, man, this is terrible, scary. But luckily it whipped me up against a house. And I had a chance to sit there and untangle myself, collect my thoughts, and get to the house. The house, when I got there, I mean, it was very emotional to see your house flooded like that, and I'm wondering what happened to him. I tied my kayak to the gutter of the house. That's how deep it was.
Jeez.
And I smashed the window, and I called the dog, and I heard nothing the first time.
2-story house,
Yep.
the gutter.
Yep. And I called again, and I hear barking from the back of the house.
Oh, love a good dog story.
And so I really don't have any idea how I'm going to get him out. So I dive in, I go under the water, pop back up, and I swim in the airspace to get to the back of the house. I had a life jacket on.
Holy crap.
And I got caught by my refrigerator. And at one point, I'm in the kitchen and I feel something grab me, and you're like, it's like the Blue Lagoon, right? And like, what is this? And it's my refrigerator. It's the handle of the refrigerator, because refrigerators will go like this with the air trapped inside them. So I get off that, and I get up there, and there's Carson. He's got mud on his legs up to here, which means he waited as long as he could before he went upstairs. And now I've dragged myself up the stairs. By the way, this whole process has taken like 3 hours. It's now getting dark.
Oh, wow.
It's now getting dark. I didn't see another human being on the way out there, and I'm like, I realized I'm never going to get him in this kayak and get out of here alive, so I'm planning to stay the night. And all of a sudden, I hear voices, and it turned out an elderly man from Assumption Parish, a Cajun, with his two granddaughters, had heard a radio call that if you have a flat-bottom boat, come to New Orleans, people need help. And they had literally driven across the state, put their boat in the water, and were coming down my street at that time and saw a kayak tied to the front of the house and said, there's somebody in there.
Wow.
And I hollered to come around to the back, and it's like something from heaven, right? This boat appears with 3 people in it, and they're like, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
And I tell them about my dog. It was my dad's dog. I was attached to him. And the old man says, oh, I would never leave my dog, and hand him down to me. I'll never forget, I picked up Carson, who's been holding it for quite a while now, and he's doing okay. He's hanging in there. As soon as I pick up to hand him out the window, he just starts going everywhere, just losing it, like this is it.
That's what happens to you sometimes,
All the
right?
time.
Yeah.
Especially getting in a kayak.
The happy story was, they hooked my kayak to the back, they put me in the boat, and they motored us 3 miles back out. My colleagues at that point are like wondering, oh my God, what happened? I'll tell you one aside. They took a photo of me as I'm kayaking off because they thought they were never going to see me again.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Were they disappointed?
Yeah. And they said, all of a sudden we see this guy show up. There's a boat, there's a kayak, and there's a dog. And
Pooping everywhere.
Yeah.
he made it into the New York Times. There's a photo of me with Carson that night sitting in this house in New Orleans. And
Wow.
he's literally sitting 2 feet from me. Wherever I went, he would not, he's right behind me. He's like, you left me once and the house filled up with water. You're not doing that again.
Yeah.
That is,
But
by the
that's a
way,
great story,
I've told many Katrina stories. Many young journalists have asked us. Even at the Times-Picayune, they would come in. That was always the most requested story. Who's the guy with Carson? They love this. They love the dog story.
So up to that
Sweet.
point, was that the biggest story that you had written?
Oh yeah, I mean there'll be nothing that can approach that. I mean it was amazing to see. If you think about 200,000 homes with 3 feet of water or more in them. I mean you just can't.
Wow.
It's breathtaking to think
Oh,
about.
yeah.
Everybody compares hurricanes. It really wasn't the hurricane. It was the flood.
Yeah.
All right.
That set it apart. I mean we did repair that house just to give it. It was a year and a half later that I turned the lights on in that house again.
Wow.
And you had a lot of celebrities that came out and helped rebuild, right?
Oh yeah, I ran into several of them, and I got to meet Spike Lee. That was he was I never really knew what Spike Lee would be back. He was extremely diligent, great guy. In fact, there's a funny story there. Because of my job, I became the city editor. I knew everything about flood, everything about Katrina. I was getting a lot of requests to do media appearances on Anderson Cooper's show, on CNN, various shows. Well, my colleagues are starting to rib me about this at work. They're like, oh, Mr. Media, right?
Yeah, big shot.
So one day I come to work and there's a message that says, Spike Lee called for you. And I'm like, ha, ha, ha. And I wad it up and I throw it in the garbage. And I thought they're snickering at me. 2 days later, I come back into work from receptionist. Spike Lee called. He really wants you to call him. And there's a number. And so I called this number and this guy answered. I said, yeah, I'm looking for Spike Lee. He goes, this is Spike. And I go, well, this is David Meeks. He goes, oh, why aren't you calling me back? Turns out he wanted to interview me, and I went and spent 4 hours with him as he did research for the movie, and we got to know each other. And then he would call me as he was in production for fact-checking on various things that he would come across. He would just call up my line, and I really, really enjoy getting to meet people like that.
Wow.
Very committed to the cause. Saw Dennis Quaid down there, saw Sean Penn, saw a lot of people who came to doors to help.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, this was too fascinating a story to, give it short shrift, but it took up most of our time.
Yeah.
So we're going to need you to come back, sadly.
Would you come back for part 2?
There's no way I'm coming back.
Okay. I really appreciate it, and so we won't let you out of the gate. But thank you so much.
I've done the interview. Now my family will be released now? That's correct.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct.
That is funny.
Hey guys, thanks for listening.
Hope you enjoyed the show. If you want to hear more podcasts or read great articles, get involved with the MANOPOD community for men over 50 on manopause.com.
And don't forget, live life, live young.